us. One of the things that keeps coming up on this question is how much money goes into the NHS. I mean, it's billions and billions and billions. It's a huge increase in recent years under COVID and since COVID. A lot of people are asking, given that doctors say they're not well paid, nurses, radiographers, ambulance staff, everybody else, where is all that money going?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it just costs quite a lot of money to run a health service, and it does in every country. The NHS is actually one of the more efficient health services of the many health services that are providing care around the world. We're doing a pretty good job of being efficient, but things don't come cheap. We have an aging population at the moment. Many people have multiple things wrong with them. Everybody obviously looks to receive that care. So really, it's incumbent on the government, on the NHS, on everyone to figure out how to use the money we have as efficiently as possible. But at the same time, when we're seeing things like inflation really eroding the real-time value of the money that's been assigned to the NHS, it makes things really difficult. And then when we're trying to add extra costs on top of that, obviously that makes it hard. It's one of the reasons, obviously, with all these pay discussions that are being had, that people are thinking, gosh, how are we going to pay for that? Because it might sound like a lot of money that's going to the NHS, but when you look at how it's being spent, there's not money left over to deal with this sort of increase. So frankly, if there are going to be pay increases, unfortunately, the government is going to have to find a way to fund those.
Well, 45% of government spending effectively is now on the NHS. But I mean, almost half of NHS spending is going on salaries, nurses making up a huge amount of those, and obviously a lot of cleaning staff and people working in the canteen and all of that. Doctors actually are a relatively small percentage of it. They are, though, asking for the biggest pay rise of all the different, the best paid, but they're asking for the biggest pay rise. They're asking for 35%. Basically, they say it's pay restoration for what they've lost since 2010. Do you think that's a fair demand?
Well, I mean, clearly the junior doctors, as with the rest of the people who've been going into industrial action recently, feel like their pay has not kept up with inflation. And that is certainly something that needs to be assessed and explored. As to the exact number, I mean, that's not for me to say. That's really for a negotiation between the EMA and the government. But it clearly is the case that this is causing concerns, and that's important for us because, across the NHS, there's 124,000 vacancies. So if the junior doctors are telling us that this is playing an important role in the recruitment and the retention of really valuable staff that we need in the NHS, it's clearly something that we need to pay attention to.
Why can't the NHS recruit enough doctors, enough nurses? Aren't there sort of more than 100,000 nurses spaces or something that's still in need? They seem to be able to be absolutely fine when it comes to recruiting a diversity officer or any other paper push. And I know you need people who organise the operations. I know you're going to need people who organise people getting paid and paying the rent on the buildings. I get all of that. We're not going to pretend that every single person working in the NHS needs to have a scalpel in their hand and a mask on. However, there is a real concern that the NHS is incapable of hiring people doing the jobs we need them to do, the doctors, the nurses, the ambulance staff, but seems to be able to hire other people. Is the NHS... Are NHS hospitals, are they not allowed to say, for instance, we've got a massive shortage of doctors, let's pay more to hire these doctors? Are they required to pay a certain wage and they can't offer any more? And is that what's stopping them?
I think that what's stopping them is supply, to be honest. While there are, of course, lots of doctors and nurses in the UK and others from outside the UK who might want to come to the UK, it is the case that we don't have enough of these.
Why not?
We don't have enough in the pipeline because we haven't had a decent workforce plan for many years.
And whose responsibility was that?
That is the government. And
so the government, wait a second. So this is the thing. The government has had, I'm completely, plague on everyone's houses here. The government has the responsibility to have a workforce plan for the NHS, but the NHS chief executive runs the NHS. I mean, the NHS Confederation. You're representing. You speak for the whole healthcare system in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Why has no one in the NHS thought, oh, maybe we should have a plan for how many doctors, nurses and ambulance staff we might need?
Well, I mean, clearly it's obviously the sensible thing to have a workforce plan. Any industry would consider that to be
But the
sensible
NHS
thing.
management didn't do it.
Well, they've been trying to do it for some time. There's various things that have got in the way of doing that.
What?
Obviously, there's a lot of politics that influences the NHS on a day-to-day basis. There's an ebb and flow, and these things all have essentially get in the way of having this really sensible, funded, costed plan where we know how many people we're going to need and then we plan accordingly.
But I don't understand. I would have thought this was even back of the envelope stuff. It's like how many people end up in hospital at any certain age. We've got an ageing population. These are the demographics. We've got an extra 5 million people from immigrants. We've got people who are ageing. We've got this many children born. This is the fertility rate. We know how many maternity nurses we're going to need, midwives. We know how many geriatric care doctors we're going to need. The likelihood of people are getting fatter, right? They're going to need more cancer doctors. I think that with no medical expertise whatsoever, I would be able to ask the right questions and be able to come up with some rough number of how many we'd need and then say, right, we're going to have to start training X number and Y number of these people. Why was that not done by NHS management? And then even if the government wouldn't agree to it, that could have been published and said, look, this is what we think we need. Can someone put pressure on the government to make sure they provide these numbers? I'd have been telling the bloody government ministers to be spending the money and training up the right number of doctors. Why did no one, well paid among them, NHS executives, not do a plan for the NHS workforce?
I think many people have over the years, but the problem is getting everybody bought into a common vision. And the problem is with particularly thinking about doctors and nurses and some of the other specialist allied health professionals, is that they take a long time to train. That is a significant investment. So you really need to plan in advance and invest that money early so that by the time those people are graduating, and of course once they've graduated, they obviously need to continue working within the health service for many years to become more and more specialists. So it really is a long-term proposition. So I think that what we need is for the people who are responsible, the government, NHS England, others, to really take the long-term view here, because that is the only way that we're going to be able to get through this challenge.
It is, and again, we have 24/7 news. People don't worry about these things when they should be. But again, I would have thought that people on six-figure salaries in the NHS executive perhaps might have thought this was worth them doing. Can I ask you about the co-chair of the British Medical Association's Junior Doctors Committee? That's Dr. Rob Lawrenson. He's on the front page of a lot of papers. A lot of people recognise him as incredibly baby-faced. He's actually not a baby at all. He's a grown man. But he has gone on holiday during these strikes. He's been orchestrating these strikes. He, though, has decided to go off on holiday to go to a friend's wedding. So he's not going to be docked any money for and be on strike pay. Because he's already taken that as holiday leave. It's not a good look, is it, going off on holiday while 350,000 patients are having their operations and procedures and appointments cancelled?
I mean, it's not really for me to comment on people's holidays. What I would comment on is that it is becoming very frustrating to everybody that the negotiators for the junior doctors and the negotiators for the government have found themselves in this stalemate. Meanwhile, we have huge disruption across the NHS. So I think that what we at the NHS Confederation really want to see, and what our members are telling us they need to see, is the government and the junior doctor negotiators coming together and having genuine, proper conversations that result in some kind of resolution, because we can't keep going on like this. It's not good for anyone. It
is quite extraordinary that we've got these strikes that are affecting so many people. There's talk about millions being affected in the month ahead because of the knock-on effect of the Easter 4-day weekend. There's going to be a backlog and then 4 days, and consultants on their Easter holidays, then another weekend. Huge, big impact. That they are not currently round the table, and the health secretaries of Barclay say you've got to call off strikes before you get round the table. They won't call off strikes because they believe that's what's going to get them a decent pay deal. That cannot be acceptable when patients are suffering, can it?
I mean, health leaders up and down the country are saying, my goodness, please, can you just get to the table and have those discussions? And honestly, if they're not able to do that, if they're not able to break this stalemate, then it is probably time for them to consult mediation, look to services like ACAS to really help get those conversations moving. That is what everybody needs right now.